in episode 6.2. I have Rich and Jordan with us today. So 6.2 series about the Paycheck Protection Program, which, Rich, thank you for correcting me on that. We corrected everything online and got that straightened around. Jordan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your expertise with all this and how you've been helping folks out?
Sure. My name is Jordan Butler. I am an attorney in Columbus, Ohio with Carlile, Patchen, and Murphy. We're sort of a mid-sized firm, under 50 attorneys, and our focus is business. That's a very broad term. So that covers pretty much anything that you would think of from a business perspective, contracts, real estate, mergers and acquisitions, et cetera. We do business litigation as well, and both personal and business succession planning. I have been with the firm for just over 6 years now. I am in our business groups and do a lot of those business matters that I just mentioned. I also do a lot of tax work in terms of research and structuring, not so much on the personal side, but the business side. I have an LLM in taxation from the University of Miami, Florida. So I get tasked with doing a lot of that type of work for the firm. And this Paycheck Protection Program, even though it's not specifically a tax law, I've sort of become our internal go-to person on that as well.
That's awesome. And it was pretty ironic. Rich had reached out. We wanted to get an attorney and finance professional on for our second call, and it was interesting, him bringing you into the call, and you and I had met randomly back in December, was it?
Yeah, it was 2019. I don't know
Okay.
that I remember specifically the date, but it's not too long ago for sure.
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago. Definitely a small world out there, so we appreciate you coming on. I know Rich has been working with you guys pretty extensively to get his program up and running, and it sounds like it's going really well for him. We're still, doing what the bank needs us to do and trudging forward. So, thank you so much for coming on.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll get a link to you guys and you specifically up on the podcast when we air it. Typically, like I told Rich the last time, we try and put everything together within a week, but these subjects are so day to day that we'll have Luke put it together and try and launch it tonight or tomorrow morning for everyone listening. So, Rich, what things have you found out since last Friday? It hasn't even been a week yet, us working together and talking through this. What has changed? And Jordan, obviously, weigh in whenever needed.
Well, I'll start with something my wife reminds me of every day, and she is my business partner. I don't know half of what I need to know, but I'm always trying to learn it. So, I keep researching. I've asked a lot of questions, and our process has gone along quite well so far. I'm going to go back to something I just took a quick note on the correction you mentioned of paycheck protection, not payroll protection.
Yes, thank you.
And it's an important clarification, and this goes into what I've learned, because the intent of this act is certainly to keep businesses solvent, but really go the step beyond that. It's to keep payroll going for the individuals so that they don't get into trouble. So the real focus for us is thinking about each of our 100-odd employees and what we can do. If they've got work ongoing, that's great. If they don't, what happens to them over the next couple of months?
Yeah.
And what I've learned is my HR director manager is exactly who I thought she was, because when I told her that we had our verbal approval from Heartland Bank, and they've done a yeoman's job, great job on things, yesterday, saying that they had gotten an approval from the Small Business Administration, and we're just now waiting on an e-signature to come through from the bank to then kick it into funding to finalize it. And that could happen today, tomorrow at the latest probably, but certainly by end of week. My HR manager got tears in her eyes, and I knew exactly what it was. She knew all of her family that she takes care of every day are not going to face financial hardship for the next couple of months.
Yeah, that's
and that's critical. Yes. Yeah, and that's just a reaffirmation of hiring the right people, because And she was certainly looking at it for herself and her family, but that was what it was all about. It's payroll protection, yes, but paycheck protection so that we can take care of our people and keep them solvent.
Yeah.
In doing that, it's going to allow us to also keep our company going through this tough time so we can emerge from it. And as I told you in the last call, and aside from that, my marketing efforts have been focusing on where we could go to get new business going or ramp up business that's not impacted by this. And interestingly, we've got several Chinese clients that are gearing up fast because Wuhan just opened up again today for travel with some restrictions. And that was the worst place in the world a month ago. But we've got some clients in pharma that are working on viruses, virology and medicines that are gearing up fast, and we're going to get real busy with them. So things work like with our attorney friend here coming back in a small world syndrome. This all goes in circles and cycles. If you're doing the right thing, you end up looking lucky, which is right where we ended our last conversation.
Yeah.
Pretend you're going to work just like there was nothing wrong. Just focus where it needs to be, and we can come out of this stronger, potentially.
Yeah.
So, what I've learned and on some clarifications, and Jordan responded on this just about 45 minutes ago. A big one that I've been seeking for a week was trying to get a read on exactly how 401ks apply, and in our case, a defined benefit plan, which is similar but not quite the same, how that applies both into the front end of the formula, which mine's already approved. So whatever it is, and I don't have the final details on that from the bank yet. But the rear end of it on what we do after we're funded, if we can apply the monies that come from that loan to that program, that retirement plan, and count that against what's forgivable.
Right. So when you
the second, yep,
real quick, when you did your calculation, you went ahead and figured those monies into your calculation, though. Now the question is can you actually apply those funds to?
Well, the application doesn't give you an opportunity to do all that. It's a pretty simple formula that doesn't float everything into it. So we provided all this other documentation and then detailed out our thought process.
Right.
So now the bank is plugging that into their own tables and figuring out this is exactly what we've gone for. So I've still got a little bit of mystery, which is, again, one of those things I've learned. I don't know what the exact amount is, but the worst case is covering all the health and dental and our rent, utilities, and certainly with payroll on an average of a monthly average over the last year times 2.5.
Well, and that's a good point that you bring up, and Jordan, you can probably speak to this very easily, is on the updated application, it has the final calculation for the PPP plus the EIDL is all figured in, or is that portion what you've already been funded if you applied for the EIDL and received the $10,000 quick cash thing that they did right out of the gate?
Yeah, so how it works with the EIDL, and this might be a theme where it's sort of like we're still not exactly sure. The CARES Act says you can use the proceeds from the Paycheck Protection Program loan to refinance any EIDL loan that the words were made prior to April 3rd, 2020.
Okay.
The way it's written makes me think that if you receive funds from the EIDL loan after April 3rd, you're not shut out of the PPP loan program. It's just you cannot refinance those funds. And by refining those, it essentially increases your loan amount, funds you can use. And I believe that as long as you use those for forgivable purposes, that they would be forgiven.
Okay.
Now, the $10,000 advance gets subtracted out of that because the CARES Act already says, well, you don't have to repay it. So you would sort of be double dipping by including that, which is already free, and then potentially having forgiveness of that amount as well.
Okay. Yeah, that was a little confusion on my end when I was filling out our application, because we have cost of goods sold and rent and, some of those other things that when we did our calculation for the PPP, we left out. And when we applied for the EIDL directly, that was an extremely simple process, very high level numbers. So I'm not, they haven't reached back out to us to ask for supporting documentation or anything like that. So I'm definitely curious about how, how that comes to fruition.
Well, I know that if the EIDL loan does not get rolled into the PPP loan, that the CARES Act says essentially you need to use funds from those two different loans for different purposes.
Okay.
So if you're using PPP funds to pay payroll, you would want to use the EIDL funds for other operating costs, and the allowable uses are a little broader with the EIDL funds.
Okay, very interesting. And I don't know if the banks and the bankers know the answers to those questions yet either. That was one of the questions that I proposed and never heard back. So that kind of told me that they were trying to figure that out at this point.
There's one of the things I don't know that I learned also, but Jordan, certainly with his combination legal and the tax background, probably has a much better fix on, was the impact of FICA on the employers versus the employees side, and how that will calculate in to the baseline number plus what's forgiven down the road. I'm trying to go through, and I'm a little too wonky probably, and trying to calculate out to the penny and over the last couple of months, or the next couple of months exactly, what column everything goes on spending. So I'm probably overthinking it, but I saw a new brief came out from the Department of Treasury that mentioned that breakout, that the employees portion will not be applied into that formula. So maybe, do you have anything on that, Jordan?
Oh yes, where do I begin on that one? That's a topic that I spent a lot of time the last couple of days going through, and so before I feel better already. Yeah. So before I start down that road, I should probably give my lawyer disclaimer that, anything I say here should not be deemed by anyone to be legal advice that you should do this or should not do this. It's always a case-by-case basis, so I want to be careful that no one's relying too heavily on this as actual legal advice. And like I said before, there's a lot of, I think, that I'm going to say, because we're still not sure on a lot of this stuff. But so let's talk about the federal payroll tax, which what we're talking about is FICA, Social Security, which is a 6.2% tax charged to employers on employee wages, and Medicare, which is 1.45 that you get to at 7.65%. So the Act defines payroll costs. It says compensation with respect to an employee. It lists out, wages, salary, etc., retirement benefit, healthcare plan costs, and it says state and local taxes. It then says that it specifically excludes taxes imposed or withheld under certain sections of the Internal Revenue Code during the covered period. Now, sort of by omission, that seems to indicate, well, if our covered period is February 15, 2020 through June 30th, 2020, for purposes of receiving a loan, using a loan, and calculating the loan amount, then by saying it excludes those taxes during the covered period implies that it includes them outside of the covered period. So you could read that as saying, well, payroll taxes that I, as an employer, paid prior to February 15th would be includable in my loan calculation. The SBA, in their FAQ that they released late Monday night, said, no, you don't include it. But their reasoning was, to me, a little odd. They said, really, when we talk about gross costs, you need to look at the gross kind of from the employee's perspective, that, you're not backing out federal income taxes withheld from the employees, but at the same time, you shouldn't include your portion of federal payroll taxes. And in a footnote, they sort of explain this. And, they cite to the legislative purpose of ensuring workers remain paid and employed. And if you think about that, my question is, well, who is ultimately in control of whether employees are employed? It would be the employer. So if the purpose is to keep people employed, what you would want to do from a gross perspective is look at the employer's gross costs, which would include federal payroll taxes. And the other thing that I saw over the weekend was a tweet from U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, who's a part of the Senate's Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And I've been following him more in the last week, not because of any political leanings, but because he's been putting out a ton of stuff on this program. Is he tweeted on Saturday that the SBA needs to make clear that the Senate's intent was to cover the employer's gross, which would include the employer's share of payroll taxes. The SBA and their FAQ after that said, no, we don't believe that that was the intent. And so I think there are arguments both ways. I don't know that I would advise anyone at this point to go ahead and include them and hope that, the act backs you up there. It's clear how the SBA views it, but I'm not totally sure that, but personally, that I agree at least with their reasoning for it. But at the same time, it doesn't really matter to them, I think. So,
Jordan, can I ask you to simplify it? What's the end impact of that? Let's say I get funded tomorrow, and this was another question, just I think would be good for clarification. I get funded tomorrow. When does my 60 days start? And what would the impact of either I can count the employer contribution or not be at the end of the game?
So if you get funded tomorrow, that's when your 8-week forgiveness period starts, if you will. In terms of your ability to use the funds for allowable purposes, there's really no deadline on that. If you still have funds left over after 8 weeks, you can still use them. They just won't be forgiven. But I don't think there's any doubt that you cannot use the borrowed funds to pay federal payroll taxes going forward, because it does explicitly say that those are excluded during the covered period. And covered period, like I said, technically ends June 30th. So it's going to encompass where we are now. So that is still at a cost to employers that they will need to pay outside of the loan funds.
In search of simplicity, then, what that boils down to, it sounds like, is the question is, do you put it into your formula for how much you're seeking for the loan? But no matter what, it's not going to be forgivable monies at the end.
Correct.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's where the clarification was in. I read that same primer that you just referred to, and I believe, if I'm remembering it right, it said going forward, but if you had already applied, that having that plugged in was going to be accounted.
Yeah, what it says is there's a couple parts. First, on the first page of the FAQ, it says, essentially, this is not law, this is just a guide. And then later it says, if you've relied on previous guidance or the act or whatever before this came out, then you should be fine.
They're not going to give you the you should have known.
Yeah, they'll leave you alone unless they can somehow prove that you did something wrong, knowingly, purposefully, or something like that.
Good answer, because that last one is the piece I was looking for. That you just clarified. It was what I'm assuming, but I didn't see any clear language on it, which is you're going to pay the employer's contribution period, and it won't be forgiven as part of that formula at the end. So that's not going to go into your 25% of outside of payroll cost.
Nope. And the way it's written, it's technically not an allowable cost, period.
Yeah.
So good stuff. Really, the only question is, can I include it in my calculation? I think there are arguments for yes. However, the safer route at this point is to exclude them. Cool.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a lot to just to take in, and each time, I do one of these podcasts, I feel like I'm pretty well versed, and then, just like when I was talking to you, Rich, on the last one, I sit here and I'm trying to wrap my head around, what I'm learning now. So definitely, Jordan, thank you so much for clarifying a lot of these things, because there's just so many unknowns at this point, especially somebody like myself that's trying to keep our business going and try and stay up with the law and calculate things correctly as we give them to the bank.
Right.
I'll jump back through the original question to me. What have I learned? Well, and Jordan's probably got updates on this as well, but as I stated in the last podcast, it looked like the total demand or need was going to be about 3 times the current funding levels. So that is working its way through draft and discussion right now. And the banks are scrambling like crazy. So I've got 2 banks for my business, Chase and then Heartland Bank. And Chase was getting in touch with me, and my private banker there called to say, hey, they could push us through fast. So I heard a lot of feedback going across the Twitterverse that people calling the big banks were being told they had to wait till the existing customer relations were taken care of first. So I don't know if that's come full cycle yet, but I was told by Chase last week, we'll put you right up front and get you done quick. My intent was to stay with Heartland. They've been our primary. Mm-hmm. But have you seen any changes on that in terms of access, Jordan?
No, I haven't. I know that when this opened up last Friday, that those that got through and got applications submitted on Friday were generally more successful with the community banks than the big ones. I don't know exactly the reason for that. I've been following the lender side of this a little bit less, just because so many of the questions that I've been answering are from the client side. But I think the big banks are generally subject to less regulation than the community banks, so it makes it a little easier. The bigger banks might also just be more conservative. Like we said, a lot of that first interim final rule came out Thursday night, and I think by Friday morning, a lot of them just said, we need to digest this. We're just not ready. Yeah. We're not comfortable pushing this through yet. I think, but now this week, in the portals that have been opened up, from what I hear, there's been problems with that the government's working on, but I think it's moving more smoothly now. It's not perfect, but I saw, to Rich's point, at one point I saw today that already $66 billion had been committed, which is actually a little less than I would have guessed. But there's an expectation that as early as tomorrow, the Senate will approve another 250 billion be allocated to this program. So the expectation is certainly, it's going to go fast, and we already need more.
Yeah. Well, and some of the banks are already shutting off applications. I got an email this morning. We also bank with Huntington, and they sent an email out this morning saying that if you don't already have your application in, we are stopping. We are no longer accepting applications for this because we're so overwhelmed. We need to get through our current applications. So
not a good PR move there.
No, not at all. And it's I'm really, like you, Rich, we work with Heartland Bank, and we got our stuff in with them immediately. And if something would have happened that we wanted to go through Huntington, we can't now, period. So.
Yeah, I think it's been critical to have the relationship with the banks, because I have put across the board that, there's no shortage of interested borrowers for any of these banks. So they don't have to worry about finding any borrowers. So they're going to start with their existing customers and those with whom they have good relationships. Mm-hmm. So anybody who just walks into a local branch and, hi, new customer here, I'd like to apply for this loan. there's only so many hours in the day and only so much money to lend out that it makes sense at this point that the banks are either saying no more or just, if we don't know who you are, if we didn't know who you were by last Friday, then we're sorry.
Right.
But we can't help you.
With the
Jordan, have you seen much movement on clients getting through like with us? We're part of that initial bunch that's been approved, not necessarily funded yet. So I'm going to guess we're still in that staunch. But have you seen clients getting funded already, and how have you seen that play out from application, those early applications to approval to funding?
I don't know that I've sort of affirmatively seen any news come through from clients yet that they've been funded. I know that sort of news of approvals are starting to trickle in. Just as of yesterday, I was still having phone calls and email correspondence with clients, still working on their applications, still getting stuff from the banks to get them in. So for the most part, it feels like it's still in application prep mode. But clearly the funds have been committed at, 66 billion or whatever that number was. In terms of actual dollars hitting accounts, I don't know that that's happened yet. I don't know that it hasn't happened either.
What about the EIDL? Because that's a direct application. You get on and you apply directly with the SBA, not through your bank. With outside of the $10,000, I guess I'll call it quick cash. How long has it been taking for people to hear back on that program?
So that program is not really a new one. It's been around for a while. You see it most commonly used natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever. And now with the coronavirus, it's been deemed a disaster for purposes of these loans.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you mentioned, they are direct loans with the SBA, and the timeline for that, based on what I've seen from the SBA, is if you apply, you can get the up to $10,000 advance within 3 days. And even if you are ultimately turned down for the loan, the advance is still free, essentially. After that, it takes like 2 to 3 weeks for them to process the application. Once it's approved, you can get an initial funding of up to $25,000 of whatever your loan amount is, and then the rest, it sort of talks about how well you'll work with one of our loan specialists in terms of getting the rest. So I don't have a time frame on that, but the $10,000 is supposed to come quickly, and then another up to $25,000 within 2 to 3 weeks after that, assuming approval.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's it. When we did our initial application, we hit submit, and that's the last that we heard. We haven't received a confirmation that it went through correctly or anything like that. So it's kind of just went into a black hole. So I was kind of interested of what that typical process looked like.
Well, it's supposed to be moving quickly. If it's not, it doesn't totally surprise me. But by far, lately, all the interest, 99% of the interest I've seen is on the PPP loans first, just because it's potentially 100% forgivable. So if you could choose between the two, and you were really just thinking about something like payroll, you want to go down the PPP loan route first. And so that's where a lot of the focus has been. But we do have some clients that had previously applied for the EIDL loans and are rolling those loans into the PPP loans.
Gotcha. So with the PPP, can you also put your cost of goods and rent and things like that? Rich, I think you had mentioned when we first jumped onto this that you did figure that into your calculation with rent and other fixed expenses, correct?
Yeah, the only missing piece on that was the 401k / defined benefit. I was asked to create a formula in terms of what was going to be in the other 25%. So I just did a quick calculation and guessed 18% for health and dental costs, 5% for rent, and the other 2% fall into utilities under what I knew was allowable, or what seemed to be clearly allowable, and did not include the funding at a average of my last year's funding. Yeah, if I took my last year's funding for the retirement plans for the company and divided by 12, I didn't plug in 2 months worth of that. So I'm still waiting to see where that one goes, whether this is something, if I've got an ability to, whether I'd be able to fund and apply that over. But at the end of the day, I probably will have more expenses or enough expenses to eat that 25% up anyways. So it may not even matter.
Interesting. So Jordan, can you shed some light on that with working capital? The WebEx that I did last week, I just pulled up one of the slides and it had EIDL working capital loans up to $2 million. It has the rates and then the terms of the loan. So the way that this slide reads from the SBA, it seems to be more than the 25,000, or am I not understanding that correctly?
Well, certainly with the EIDL loan, you can use it for a little broader category. It is intended to cover certain operating costs that the PPP loans, based on the language of the Act, do not. And the PPP loans are really restricted to the payroll costs, healthcare benefits, sort of eligible mortgage interest obligations, rent, utilities. And you can use it to pay interest on other debt. That use would not be forgivable. The forgivable uses are limited to payroll costs, rent, utilities, and I think covered mortgage interest.
Okay, so those that are looking for additional help with not utilities, but need additional help with accounts payable would also want to do the EIDL loan.
Yeah, I think that's where you'd want to go. If you need to replenish inventory or pay independent contractors, which it appears you cannot do with the PPP loan funds, you would want to do that. And I guess what you would want to be careful about is if you already have an EIDL loan, if you roll it into the PPP loan, then you might be restricting yourself now what you can do with it, because they essentially become PPP loan funds at that point. And now, your ability to replenish inventory, pay independent contractors, or other expenses is probably going to be restricted.
Yeah. And it is interesting, especially with our company. I mean, people are just hoarding cash. So, your receivables are getting stretched out a little bit longer, and that obviously is trickling through everyone right now, because nobody's wanting to give up their cash to pay their payables, which, for companies like us that have receivables and payables, it's like, okay, guys, what are we all trying to do here? We can't shut everything down just because of the unknown. So that's the thing that's really interesting to me, is especially with the EIDL loan, is we want to pay our vendors and partners as quickly as possible, regardless of what our customers are doing on their end. So that portion would be very helpful for us.
I hit one other interesting facet. Again, I was trying to project forward on costs and everything. So we've got a number of employees who are in excess of $100,000 in salary. So the excess was backed out of the formula for the loan application. So then I was trying just to clarify, with some of them, I've still got work for them. With a couple, we won't have work for them. So figuring out what we can do to be able to adjust for that until and unless the clients where we had these technical experts assigned are back up and running and need the contract labor support. So the likelihood is there that rather than having these people go off of payroll entirely, that we can still keep as solvent as possible and take salaries down to that $100,000 level and use that as opposed to just laying them off and having them going into the unemployment system. So they'll still be better off than not having pay and their health and dental and everything carried, but we can keep our cash flow as strong as possible so we can keep the strength of the company up so that if this extends a long period, we'll be better able to do it. And I'll move from that into good news. If you didn't see it this morning, the Fed's main projecting device for deaths went down again to about 60,000.
Yes.
It was like 61,000 deaths, which is great news. Stock market's up pretty nicely today, I think mostly off of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that goes back, the retention goes back to your original point when we talked last Friday. It was just retaining those folks. So I'm sure that there's going to be companies that don't do either one of these programs and have to let folks go, which means that companies like you, Rich, are going to be able to recruit just a better type employee for yourself and for your clients. But it'll be interesting for those companies that do drop a salary down, how many employees end up leaving and trying to go find, work other places that are still willing to keep their salary the same.
Yeah. We're doing a search for a maintenance manager, factory maintenance tech, a senior level person. Boy, is it easier today than it was a month ago.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Got all kinds of options.
Yeah. Yep. No, we did the same thing. We had to part ways with one of our folks that was over 100, and we're getting applications that are far less than what we were originally paying for a better applicant, quite honestly. So it is very interesting how the employment market is, I don't know if I want to use the word correcting itself, but it's definitely lowered the bar as far as salary and things like that. So
supply and demand. And,
yep.
But again, going back to paycheck protection, that's really at the end of the day the biggest priority is just trying to do everything you can to keep people funded through this period. So whether they're with our company or have a different opportunity at the end of it, that everybody stays solvent, can be a consumer, and keep the economy going.
And as we wrap up here, Jordan, is there anything that we have missed or you've been thinking about that you think everyone should know as we close up here?
A couple things I'll hit on, just sort of going back real quick to what Rich was just talking about. Just to make sure we're clear that my belief is, and based on everything I've seen and read, is, with respect to those employees who make over 100, you can certainly still pay them out of the loan funds. You can't pay them in excess of 100, as would be prorated during that monthly period. So if we look at that 8 weeks, the gross during those 8 weeks would be like 16,666, I guess. Yep. On 100,000. Now you could keep them at whatever their normal salary is, and basically say, all right, we'll pay up to X amount out of the loan funds, and we'll just pay the difference out of operating costs. So you don't necessarily have to reduce them if you're otherwise able to handle it. What else is interesting about them is what the Act says is, when it looks at the potential for reduction of forgiveness, it says, well, anyone making under 100, if you reduce their pay by 25%, then your forgiveness is going to be reduced. The implication there is that you can go all the way, if anybody who's over 100, you could go from 100 to 0 without any effect, other than losing an employee for purposes of measuring whether your employee count has changed. But it's not, in that case, it's not a up to 100,000 type thing. It's just, if they're over 100,000, you can reduce them as much as you want without penalty. And also the FAQ by the SBA that came out a couple days ago, it does contain some guidance saying that when we talk about that 100,000, we're really just talking about sort of base compensation, not including your costs for their health care or retirement, what have you.
Okay.
Another thing that is going to be very important in the coming days is independent contractors, sole proprietors, and quote unquote eligible self-employed individuals are eligible for these loans. There's not a whole lot of guidance out there about how it's going to work for them. They can technically begin applying this Friday, but I would expect the SBA to put out a decent amount of guidance on how that's going to work for them before Friday, and hopefully not Thursday night at 11 o'clock. But it's something to keep an eye on in the coming days, because I know I have had a lot of inquiries from independent contractors and sole proprietors. Hey, how do I? Can I get in on this? And it's sort of like, well, yes, but beyond that, I don't know what to tell you, because I don't really know much else about how that's going to work. I think I know how it's going to work, but I don't know if I want to go down that road yet without further guidance. So keep an eye on that. And the last thing that I thought was sort of interesting from the FAQ is the Act says that in determining your loan amount, you look at the 12 months prior to the application date. And the SBA said, well, you can actually use calendar year 2019 if you want to. So it's not necessarily supported by the Act, but I think I understand why they did it. It's because it would be so much easier for most employers to figure out all those costs January 1 to December 31 versus, April 9th, 2019 to April 8th, 2020. But just something to keep in mind there, that if you were to just look at the Act, you'd say, all right, I got to look at the last 365, but they will allow you to just use the calendar year 2019.
That actually brings up a great point, because I was struggling with that with myself, because we had things going on at the beginning of this year that increased our fixed expenses and so forth. And what I was reading is you had to use 2019. We could not figure into the calculation, the first quarter, if you will, for those adjusted expenses with employees and so forth. So
yeah, the FAQ says you can basically pick. So
okay.
Anyone who's not applied yet, if you essentially run the numbers under both scenario and see which one works out better for you.
Okay. No, that's very good to know. When we submitted our supporting documents to the bank, I included both, but what I put on our application was just for 2019, and that was something that I wanted to work through with the bank as to how we actually calculated that. So that's interesting. Jordan, if you will, email me the link to the FAQ page, and what we'll do is we'll post that in the description. We'll also, post some highlights in the description, and contact information again for Rich. Jordan, we can forward on, or we can give people your direct dial, whichever you would prefer. And if you need more specific legal advice, it's probably best to reach out directly to you, Jordan, or how would you like to do that?
Yeah, probably so. The best ways right now would be email.
Okay.
And I'll provide my direct office number. I'm working from home these days, like so many others.
Yeah.
But if I get a voicemail, I'll get a notification that I have a voicemail, and can get back in touch with anyone that way.
Well, why don't you tell everyone how they can contact you, and then we'll put the number and email in the description.
So my email address is JC, as in Charles, Butler, BUTLER, at CPMlaw.com. That's Carlile, Patchen, and Murphy. My direct dial is 614-628-0797. And also, you can find all my information on our website, www.cpmlaw.com.
And obviously, anyone that wants to reach out and give us feedback and ask questions, feel free to email us at info@mfgmonkey.com. Funny name, big topic. And we really, appreciate Jordan, you coming on. Rich, we appreciate you getting Jordan to come on, and I'm sure that folks will have have a lot of questions, and then, maybe we can do another follow-up session with any other updates as the times come. Jordan, if you learn more about the 1099, good, bad, or indifferent, if you'd be willing to jump back on and talk through those things, that would be great. I know some of our 1099 folks were asking those questions as well, as, okay, how does this work for us, and when can we apply if we can, and all those things. So definitely a lot of uncertainty for those folks, unfortunately, that are straight 1099.
Yep. But I got to think we're going to get some answers soon. Otherwise, they're really sort of flying blind.
Sure.
Going into this Friday without further guidance.
Yeah. Well, and it may be that everyone is flying blind because you can figure in your 1099 employees / contractors into the Paycheck Protection Program, and maybe
that's not the case.
That is not the case.
No.
Okay.
How they're treated as, they're essentially treated as they're their own business. They can get their own loan. So you cannot include your payments to them in determining your loan amount. And based on how it's all defined, you also can't use the funds to pay, your independent contractors. So
Interesting.
To the extent that you have them, you would need to find either another way to do it, whether it be through another loan, an EIDL loan, or just from the operating income that you do have.
Okay, that was a question that came up during the WebEx with the SBA, and either they misspoke or is that an update by chance in the last week or so, or has that always been the case?
It's more of a clarification.
Okay.
Certainly when I first looked through this, I thought that the way I read it is they are included. It's sort of, if you parse the language very carefully, you can sort of see why they would be excluded. And what's come out of the SBA since has been pretty crystal clear. No, you cannot include them. They are eligible for their own. And I think that makes a little bit of sense because, if I could include them, amounts I've paid to independent contractors in determining my own loan amount, and they can include amounts they've received in determining their loan amount.
It's like going on unemployment and still getting paid to work.
Yeah, there's two separate loans made on the same dollar.
Exactly.
So
no, I totally agree with you, and I'm glad that clarification came out, because I understood that differently up until right now. So very good.
And all this goes into the overall theme of if you own a company or you're managing one, have really good attorneys that you have a relationship with, have a really good bank that you have a relationship with, and have a great accounting firm where you've got smart people that can help you and answer questions when you really need it.
Exactly. Well, and this is obviously very enlightening for us, for me specifically, and I'm sure everyone that listens will see a lot of value. And again, I can't encourage people enough to email, ask questions, and we'll respond and try to get them answered as quickly as possible. Feel free to reach out to Jordan, and he's been a huge help for everyone that he's touched. So guys, thanks again for coming on. Let's get this wrapped up. I know we're approaching an hour here, and I know my attention span kind of checks out after about 45 minutes. So we'll get this wrapped up, and unless anyone has anything else to add before we close up, and we'll get this published as soon as possible.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan.
Yep, thank you, Rich. Thank you, Dustin.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, Rich, thanks again. We'll talk to everyone soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.